Assalamu alaikum again. So Samira has given you sort of almost a bird's eye view from everything that we need to do, from maybe perhaps seeing a professional counselor to laughing more. You know, there's sometimes I think we tend to, as a community, take ourselves so seriously, and with good reason. But there are times also that I think non-Muslims just think that we don't have fun, that we don't, play with each other, that we don't laugh, that we don't find even humor in some of the most mundane details of our lives. And so for many outside of the community, we're very one-dimensional, right? And so when they see something that strikes them as unusual, or, I saw these two people laughing and kind of joking with each other, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of what people do. But it's something that's always like noteworthy, right? And so I think there was like a meme or something on Instagram that was going around. It was a young lady that was like dancing to some music in the background, and I was like, how many people dance at home? Raise your hand. Come on, seriously. Right? I mean, just kind of impromptu sort of dance parties is what I usually do to kind of like break up some of the monotony, even in my own kind of family life, right? My son is almost 2 years old, and I swear, I posted something, he was dancing to the theme song to Law and Order, okay? And I didn't know, I was like, oh gosh, people are gonna be like, what do they watch in their house but it was just something that I think I watched like maybe 10 or 15 times in a row, just because it was a moment that was like innocence, that was lighthearted, and these are the things that we really need to sustain us. And so I'm thankful for Samira for giving us that overview, and what I wanted to kind of turn our attention to is trying to bring out some of the theoretical to actually what is happening with the people in this room. Okay, so we tried to bring in a little technology, so bear with us. But sometimes when we think about, what is the percentage of people with mental health, or stress-related disorders, how many Muslims in the community are experiencing some level of anxiety and depression, we hear numbers, right? We hear something like 1 in 5 American Muslim women reported actually feeling some degree of emotional trauma as a result of the election. Right? So 1 in 5, 20%, something like that. We also hear numbers about the kinds of religious and racial discrimination that American Muslims also experience. These are things that impact us psychologically, but those are sometimes numbers, right? So I wanted us to kind of just in this room, put some sort of like meat on the bones to that, right? So if you look at the screen here, some of you have already begun doing it, but it asked, have you experienced increased stress, anxiety, or depression as a result of the 2016 presidential election, right? So how many people in this room have a smartphone? Everybody raise your hand, right? So just texting, that's the phrase there, Kameelah Rosh 412, to 22333, right? And then A or B. So increased anxiety or depression as a result of the election, yes is A, or B is no, okay? So I want everybody just to take like 30 seconds and respond to that question again, so we can see in real sort of live time, what are people experiencing in this room? Okay, how many people have already done that? Okay, some people are busy getting their response in. And I also want you to think about when you see something like this, again, this poll is only open to the people in this room, okay? So it looks like of everyone who's responded, 80% said yes, I've experienced some kind of stress or anxiety as a result of the election. I mean, it's been an interesting year, to say the least. And so these are the things that are on our minds. And so we want to sort of keep this fresh with us as we move into what are some self-care strategies that we want to start to develop, given the fact that almost 80% of us are saying yes. There's been something happening in my life, whether or not I relate it to the presidential election, but I've experienced something that has been negatively impacting my sense of well-being. Khadija, could you go? Okay. So again, this is anonymous. We're not keeping the information. I don't have sort of a log of anyone's numbers or responses. So I'm really going to challenge everyone in the room to be honest, right? Are you currently experiencing some kind of mental health challenge, be that stress, anxiety, depression, some kind of trauma related to things that may have happened in your life? Again, this is only open to the people in this room. It's absolutely anonymous. We don't collect any information, so we're just asking you to respond so we as a community can get a sense of, again, what is happening in this room with the people that we're sitting here with right now. And when we talk about stigma, for many people who are actually living with a mental health challenge, the stigma associated with that challenge is more difficult than the illness itself. Okay, so I'm going to say that one more time. The stigma associated with the mental health challenge is often more difficult to manage, to cope with, than the illness itself, right? Because again, we're a very resilient community. We have kind of weathered the storm over many, many years. And it's not just, again, related to who we are as Muslims, right? But some of us are not citizens, undocumented. Some of us, like myself, are descendants of enslaved Africans in this country. And so it's not just one single thing that we're trying to deal with on a daily basis, right? If you're a woman, you're dealing with sexism and patriarchy, misogyny, trying to figure out, how do I cope with the multiple identities that I have in this particular moment, okay? And so, again, this question, how many of us right now in this room are currently coping with a mental health challenge, right? More than 70% of the people who have responded in this room, right? This is not anything to be ashamed of. It is certainly indicative of, again, all of the many sources of stress that we have to deal with, in addition to just like family stuff. Like Samira mentioned, my in-laws moved in, right? It could be a transition from, my daughter went away to boarding school. That was stressful for me. I'm thinking about the kinds of interactions she's gonna have, right? Related to the fact that she's a young Black woman and also a Muslim woman, right? So even when there are positive things that happen in our life, like people are like, I got married this year, I got a new job, stress is associated even with positive things that happen, right? Because it may represent a fundamental shift in the way you organize your life, okay? So I'm gonna move to the next question, but again, I want you guys to sort of, even if you take a screenshot of this, just bear in mind that this is what's happening in our community. So this is not sort of theoretical, it's not something that we sort of like make up as mental health professionals, but these are also calls that we get from people. This is sort of in the aftermath of the Muslim ban, of a terrorist attack, of an earthquake, of a hurricane. Muslims are also impacted by all of these things, and we're struggling the best way we can to figure out how to meet the challenge. Okay, so this is a slightly different question, but related to the previous one. Do you have a family member or a friend coping with a mental health challenge? And it's often witnessing someone that you love going through something difficult and you can't do anything to change it, to fix it, to make it better. Right? So what is it like for you as someone who's witnessing someone else's pain and suffering to sit and just be with that person? Say, I'm sorry you're going through this, right? And sometimes that's the best response we can give. When people are really in a difficult moment, often the last thing they want to hear is, oh, it'll be better, right? And they're like, well, what if it's not, right? Or what if it's not right now, and that's what's most important to me? So we even have to, as family members, as friends, as loved ones, think about how do I also encourage the people that I love to engage in a practice of self-care? right? We may want to move in sort of like problem-solving mode, right? I'll just fix it, I'll make it better, it'll be fine, right? And this also happens when people are grieving, right? We hear things like, oh, you know, they're in a better place, right? They're with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are all things that if you're in the midst of that grieving, it's kind of what you don't want to hear, right? It's very helpful and often beneficial if someone says, I can't even imagine the kind of pain that you're in. You know, may Allah make it easy, right? These are things that they don't come across as guarantees or promises, but just acknowledging that it's very difficult for that person. People want to be validated. They want to be affirmed. They want to know that people are seeing them as they are in the moment, right? And then that you can also be present with them with your own discomfort, with your own anxiety about not being able to change that situation, and just caring for them, loving them, right? Sometimes it's bringing them something to eat. Those are things we can do. And so, again, this kind of strikes me as this is not unusual for a community. Of the people who've just responded in maybe the last 3 minutes, 93% say a family member or a friend is coping with a mental health challenge. We shouldn't be embarrassed by this. We shouldn't feel ashamed about this. This is just the lives that we're living. And we want to be able to then think about what are some techniques and strategies, right? In the Quran, Allah tells us we will experience something of loss and suffering, right? This is just a part of being a human being, right? So this shouldn't be a surprise, right? The Creator has already told us everything that we need to know, right? So this isn't surprising news. It's just how do we rise to meet that challenge? Khadija? She's responding to the, okay. So now this is gonna come up as whatever response you give is gonna look sort of like a word cloud. So name up to 3 issues related to mental health, addiction, or trauma that's taboo to talk about in the Muslim community. Things that we keep hidden, that we don't share, that nobody knows, we can't talk about, right? It just stays like swept under the rug, right? So as you respond, your responses will show up. Okay, so I left it open-ended. This is, what do you think are taboo topics to talk about? So for the people in the back that can't read the responses that are coming up, it's suicide, depression, sexual assault, drugs, rape, homosexuality. I've seen rape and suicide a couple of times already, right? Sexual assault is coming up again. Abuse. Forced marriages. And as professionals, we can stand up here and say, these are the things that people share with us that are taboo. This is why they come to counseling, to talk about some of the things that they're really struggling with. But this is the response from you, from the people in this room, about what is difficult, what's taboo. Depression, not getting enough love, medication. Those are things that often we don't talk about. So if you're dealing with, and I'm going to combine some of the responses, you're dealing with thoughts of suicide as a result of a sexual assault or abuse that you've experienced in your home, right? If someone tells you, well, don't go to therapy, you don't need medication for that, right? All of the taboo things that you cannot talk about is what you're dealing with silently often, and that you can't share with other people, right? Because you may think, I'm the only person who's experiencing this, because nobody talks about it, okay? Some other responses, again, coming up: bipolar disorder, suicidal thoughts, sexual orientation, domestic violence. Do these things sound about what everybody is thinking? Just by a show of hands. Some of the things that come up that are taboo to talk about, okay? And the same-sex attraction, again, hey, I'm not taboo to talk about. Sickness, cuts, I'm not sure if that means like self-harm or cutting, but that's certainly one thing that is a no-no. No one ever talks about it. And especially as it impacts young Muslim girls, self-harm is something that also men and boys experience, but people will say, I'm modestly dressed, my sleeves are long. No one would ever know that I have cuts, right, up and down my arms, right? But this is happening to young people. This is happening to other people who are also just still, again, dealing with the trauma of some of the things that we mentioned, like sexual assault and depression, drug overdose, domestic violence, forced marriages. This is what's happening in our community, and it's not a shame or dishonor in the community for us to talk about it, right? If anything, is we want to be proactive about how we deal with these things, knowing that they occur. Right, so it's more of a perspective of how do we reduce harm and suffering in our community versus, seeing this as like, oh, well, no, this never happens to Muslims. We're human beings, right? These are all the things that occur. Unfairness between different people, sex, school stress, going to a professional counselor is not accepted in Arab culture was one of the responses. Period. I don't know if that means menstruation or the punctuation mark, domestic abuse. So you've seen themes, especially around sexual assault, domestic violence, abuse, homosexuality, mental illness. These are things that we don't talk about. So if you're someone who's experiencing one or more of these things, what begins to happen? You may withdraw from people. You don't go around them. Your sense of loneliness and isolation deepens, right? You feel set apart, and those are all things that can even exacerbate feelings of suicide. Okay, Khadija, can you go to the, okay. So if you're experiencing any of the things that came up on the previous slide, or you're coping with a mental health challenge, the question here is, who would you most likely confide in first to get help? So the options are family member, friend, imam, chaplain, or religious leader, a mental health professional, or no one. So let's take a minute and see what happens.
Type in the thing or first type in the words? Yeah.
Oh, does it say on the?
Yeah, I'm just typing in the word.
Okay. By a show of hands, for how many people is this helpful? Just to see kind of in real time what's happening. Raise your hand. Okay, mashallah. So I'm going to give this another 30 seconds so we can get to the final question. Now, here's kind of the tricky balance. What begins to happen when the friend that you confide in is also experiencing his or her own challenge? Right? What do we do? Okay, another 10 seconds. And if you do want to, again, this is completely anonymous. We're not capturing and keeping any of your numbers or information at all, I guarantee you. But I think it's helpful for us to kind of bring it down from the theoretical to what's happening in people's lives, like on a daily basis. Okay. Khadija. Okay. So if you're confiding in no one or a friend, and I think something like 70% of the people in the room said that they were experiencing increased anxiety, stress, or depression as a result of the election, And I think it was like 90% said that they were coping with a mental health challenge. No, 90% of a family member or friend was coping with a mental health challenge. And I think about 70% of you said that you yourself was coping. What do you do, right? When going to a professional was not the number one answer for who you would go to first to seek help. It was a friend, okay? And sort of contrary to what a lot of the research shows, it's not the religious leader that people go to first, at least none of the people in this room, okay? And so if as friends and loved ones, we're trying to help each other, what are some things we do? If we don't go to a professional, right? We don't have any kind of formal professional counseling. One of the responses to what's taboo was to go to a counselor. So what are people doing? Comedic relief, reading, writing, always find a way to be happy. And I would say, how? How do you find a way to be happy? For some people, especially if they're experiencing depression, there is nothing that they can usually indicate that speaks to joy and happiness, right? It's very difficult. Exercise, Quran, music, reading. Someone says, my sister is my self-care strategy. That's very sweet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course. And again, tahajjud. Okay, so there's spiritual strategies, physical health strategies, some emotional support. So I'm trying to kind of give themes that are coming out, taking a deep breath, writing about it, journaling, sort of reflecting on what you're experiencing, video games, speaking to a partner perhaps. So again, kind of getting some of that emotional support, faith. So as the responses come in, and Sister Yasmina is going to expand on this, one of the ways that it becomes a consistent response for the people in this room, again, where, this is not a representative sample, if you think about research, but that faith and kind of engaging in spiritual practice is something that people often turn to, right? And going to a professional counselor sometimes is not a matter of, I don't want to, I don't know where to find one. And if I find one, it's too expensive, right? Or my insurance won't pay for it, right? So sometimes the difficulty for me, even as a mental health professional, I want everyone to seek counseling, but I'm also kind of painfully aware of the fact that some people can't afford it, right? Or you can afford maybe 1 or 2 sessions, 3 sessions, right? And you're hoping you get a miracle cure in those 3 sessions because you can't afford anymore. And so we have to think about watching lectures, ignoring it and focusing on hustling. That person, I want to talk to you after. But talking to myself, deadlifting, so that's exercising, eating right, Netflix. My daughter and I started the new season of Black Mirror last night. We watched the 2nd episode, if anyone has seen that one. She's almost 15, so I was like, I kind of get where the mom was going with that. She's like, Mommy. And so one of the ways that we can always rely on and depend on is engaging in a spiritual practice. This doesn't cost anything, right? This is something that is always close to us. We don't need an intermediary, right? Wherever we are, we can, begin to think about, how do I have a conversation with my Creator about what's happening, right? And I tell people, don't think that there has to be like a formal ritual for how you do this. Just sit and begin to talk to your Lord, right? He already knows. And so inshallah, Sister Yasmin will be able to offer some additional spiritual strategies for how we can, again, engage in self-care and improve our sense of well-being as a community, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.